So to give a bit of a context, Indonesia right now produces about more than half of the global nickel production. So in another way, it has a very big leverage to actually raise the bar in this exploitation process. But in the process, unfortunately, as you mentioned, we're still seeing a lot of challenges on the ground where the country could have done it much better. It seems to be a rushing through the door kind of attitude where the country just basically want to get ahead as soon as possible. But along the way, it kind of forget to set the bar high enough to maintain the standards.
And we have to remember that U.S. companies in particular, but also European firms as well, are not always aligned with their governments. Let's take Tesla in particular. So Elon Musk is very close now to President-elect Donald Trump. But Elon Musk and his Tesla division have done deals with Zhejiang Cobalt for nickel supplies in Indonesia. So that seems to run counter to a lot of the narratives that we've been seeing.
So I think Indonesia need to have a clear-eyed views on what actually has happened within the last 5 to 10 years, what has changed right now, and what is the potential outlook moving forward, right? Because so far, Indonesia's downstreaming on nickel is really riding on the wave of we're going to be an EV giant, right? And that statement override everything else. People don't look at the details anymore. They just kind of believe that we will become an EV giant. Although if you look at the numbers, obviously that's not the reality.
So the price of nickel today is quite low. It's like 40 to 45% lower than it was last year. Cobalt is way lower than it was in 2018. It's almost 80% lower than it used to be 5 years ago. When it comes to lithium, we are 50 to 55% lower. So when you take only the prices element, it really makes it difficult for newcomers, for new companies to raise capitals to start those projects because it just costs a lot of money. The benefits are not there. The risks are higher. So given that, it's much more easier to keep on outsourcing with what Chinese have been doing already in many countries in the Global South.
The China Global South podcast is supported in part by the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg and by our subscribers. Thank you. If you'd like to subscribe for daily news and exclusive analysis about every aspect of China's engagement in Africa, Asia, and throughout the developing world, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China Global South podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by CGSP's Africa editor, Jérôme from the beautiful island of Mauritius. A very good morning to you, Jérôme.
Good morning, Eric.
Well, we're going to talk about critical minerals and critical resources, which is your specialty, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion today with you. And we're also going to focus on what's going on out here in Southeast Asia, specifically in Indonesia. But all of this comes into focus now with the re-election of Donald Trump. Now, Donald Trump has described the Biden administration's Inflation Reduction Act. Now, that was the big piece of legislation that the United States passed under the Biden administration, focusing on critical resources and climate change. Now, Trump called it, quote, and I'm quoting here, a green scam, and he has vowed to repeal it after he returns to the White House. Now, here's the key thing. A lot of people around Trump say this is one of those cases where you can't listen to him literally, because a lot of people say that he's going to gut key parts of the Inflation Reduction Act, but not the whole thing. And so one part that he really wants to focus on, and this is going to be interesting, Shiro, to get your take on it, is more domestic mining of critical resources within the United States. Now, you recall a couple of months ago, you and I spoke with a Reuters correspondent who talked about how difficult it is, and he wrote a whole book on this, how difficult it is to get permits for U.S. mining companies to drill in the United States. That's one area where we might see the Republicans coming back into power. Again, they have full control of the government now, so they can change a lot of the laws, eliminate a lot of these regulations that have made it difficult for U.S. mining companies to dig for lithium, even a little bit of cobalt, copper, and other these critical resources that are used for technology, fighter jets, and of course, EV batteries. So that's one thing that may change in all of this. But the question that I have for you, Jérôme, is the economics of this. We're in a market right now where a lot of the prices of those metals are at 10-year lows. And that's going to make it very difficult for the United States and American mining companies, or even those from the G7, to challenge China's current dominance in certain critical minerals, namely nickel, particularly copper, and then also cobalt as well. Why don't we start our conversation today with an overview of where we are in the market and what your take is on the return of the Trump administration, what you think they're going to do?
Before even getting into the market, what the market say, we should maybe put all this, what Trump is saying about those EVs and projects, the way we are seeing that happening, into a larger context. Let's not forget that, for example, his new appointee for energy secretary is an oil tycoon. So it's going to be really interesting to look into how Trump, on one side, is going to balance the interest of the fossil fuel oil industry and also clean energy industry, knowing that he has the both of them in his camp. You have a guy like Elon Musk that has been really making money out of EVs and looking forward to expand his project around the US and around the world as well, expecting those EV clean projects to take shape. On the other side, he also has the fossil fuel oil industry that's really looking into not to see all those EVs becoming mainstream into the market. So it's going to be really interesting to see how Trump is going to balance those two group interests in a way that it makes all of them happy, which I believe that's going to be quite difficult. That being said, it's really leading me to the point of like how easy is going to see all those projects take form in the US, given the current market, the current context where it's very quite difficult. What you mentioned, it's not only proper to the US, it's also what's happening in many Western countries. I've been talking about it in my LinkedIn feed for a few weeks back with the case what's happening in Serbia, for example, with Rio Tinto, where Europe is really looking into building its lithium autonomy in Serbia. You have the civil society organization standing up and say, this project is going to be dangerous for the environment. We have to stop it. It's not good for us. We have to really put an end on this. And you have Rio Tinto, you have the US ambassador trying really to push forward with that project because it has that geostrategic autonomy importance for Europe. And when you put all of that in, you realize that it's not really easy for many Western companies to launch, in the current context, to launch now lithium and cobalt project because of the environment, the cost of it. Just to show you that the US is not really the only one in that space. That's allows country in the global south, I'd say, with much more easier regulation to be able to be the producer. And what you're going to see in the global north is going to be even a bit complex. Now, given that, now let's go into the economics of it. What's the economics are telling us? The economics are telling us that it's not good news right now to launch a new project. They cost you a lot of money. Price in the markets are low for cobalt, for lithium, for nickel. They are all low. And now we are seeing more and more giants, Western giant mining companies telling you we cannot do without Chinese because China is much more cost effective. We had Albemarle, the lithium producer, the largest lithium producer in the world, American, saying that we cannot do without China because China is basically the one controlling the market. We cannot do that at cost without China. Same thing happened with nickel, where Eramet, the French company, saying, you know what, China is the technology, as the way, knows how to build those things at cost effective. We cannot do it without China. So when you put now the whole economic, the environment context, all the environment element into the mix, you now puts the geopolitical element in all of that. It just leads you back to that debate we've been having for almost a year now about how much the Western countries are sound in a strategy to compete with China in this current context, which is very much difficult because you have a mix of internal politics, environment, international market, the price and all of that, which just makes it very difficult for them to compete.
And we have to remember that U.S. companies in particular, but also European firms as well, are not always aligned with their governments. Let's take Tesla in particular. So Elon Musk is very close now to President-elect Donald Trump. But Elon Musk and his Tesla division have done deals with Zhejiang Cobalt for nickel supplies in Indonesia. So that seems to run counter to a lot of the narratives that we've been seeing. But again, I want to come back to this pricing question because we cannot understand this dynamic without understanding the prices. If you could just focus specifically on where are we right now in the price of nickel, cobalt, and manganese and some of these key metals, that will then explain why so many American companies will stay on the sidelines and why subsidized Chinese companies will still be able to remain in the market.
So the price of nickel today is quite low. It's like 40 to 45% lower than it was last year. Cobalt is way lower than it was in 2018. It's almost 80% lower than it used to be 5 years ago. When it comes to lithium, we are 50 to 55% lower. So when you take only the prices element, it really makes it difficult for newcomers, for new companies to raise capitals to start those projects because it just costs a lot of money. The benefits are not there. The risks are higher. So given that, it's much more easier to keep on outsourcing with what Chinese have been doing already in many countries in the global south, allowing them to, okay, we're not going to start with new exploration, not going to start with new projects. We're just going to keep on outsourcing our supply from Chinese company, because them being on the beginning of the supply chain with taking the risk of doing those mining in risky environments allows them to cut the risk for many Western companies in terms of, instead of starting a green project, a new one, we can actually buy from Chinese. As I say, it's cut the risk. It allows them to also cut the cost they can be engaging in when they have to start by themselves. So when you put all of that into context, it just makes it much more difficult to launch new projects right now. That's why you had many companies closing projects in Australia, in the US, in Europe, because it just doesn't make sense from an economic point of view. They're trying to raise capitals which are not available right now to do because the market is not good. And given the price of the market, many have been suspecting Chinese companies to engage into geopolitical move just to keep the cost of entry high and just make it difficult for new competitors to join the market.
Well, let's take a look at copper right now. The Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, that's one of the big think tanks in DC. They just published a beautiful new report, multimedia spinning pieces of red metal around. I mean, we'll put the link to it in the show notes. It's absolutely stunning. But they focused on Latin America's role in the critical resource supply chain, specifically focusing on copper. And they gave 3 recommendations. And the reason why they focused on copper is because 46% of the world's copper supply comes from Latin America, South America, specifically Chile and Peru. And I'd like to get your take on the 3 recommendations that they put forward, because they may apply to other parts of the world as well, specifically in the context of how the U.S. can better compete with the Chinese. So number 1, support long-term offtake agreements with projects under development. So one of the advantages that the Chinese have is they've locked up multi-decade deals in many cases with mining companies and suppliers around the world for critical resources. CSIS is saying the U.S. should do the same thing. And here's the one that you've been talking a lot about. Leverage de-risking tools such as concessional financing, equity, and risk insurance. Risk insurance is the secret weapon of the Chinese, who have Sinosure. And that's what gives a lot of Chinese mining companies a backstop when they go into very risky countries like the Democratic Republic of the Congo to do these deals, because they've got that risk insurance. Here, CSIS is saying concessional financing and risk insurance, 2 things the Chinese do a lot of in their mining sector, the Americans should emulate. And then finally, they should add copper to the U.S. Geological Survey's critical minerals list to allow it to benefit from current and future incentives. Let's put number 3 aside for now because it's more of a domestic issue. But I'd like to talk about number 1 and number 2, these offtake agreements and concessional financing, equity, and risk insurance. Do you get the sense that in the Trump administration, that this is something that they're going to be interested in doing?
I believe they're going to be interested in doing that because it has that business component into it. And it just makes sense from an economic perspective. If you do want to guarantee your access to those minerals, unless you have your own mining company doing the digging, you're going to have to sign offtake agreements. You're going to have to really engage yourself into 5-10 years offtake agreements, allowing companies to supply you with the raw material that you need. And many companies have been doing that. Many big, even traders company have been doing that by signing those long-term offtake agreement. It allows them it puts cash into the hand of mining companies. Mining companies are making all the operation on the ground, and those who are signing those offtake agreement having access to a lot of minerals. And you see that with a lot of trading companies. Glencore, which is also a mining company, also trading companies doing that. IMX, which is CMOC and trading companies brand Home is also doing that. So we see a lot of that happening on the ground. And I do believe that if the Trump administration want to say, okay, you know what, we're not going to go into putting money into mining or to encourage what, for example, a company like Cobalt has been doing in Zambia, trying to also do that in the DRC. If we're not going to support companies like this, at least we can engage into long-term offtake agreement with different mining companies around the world, allowing us to have access to those minerals, which is going to be much more easier for them. Which leads us...
Yeah, the Cobalt, I just wanted to explain to everybody, the company that you referenced is a very high-profile American startup backed by, I think, by Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and lots of people from the Silicon Valley are behind that, yeah. To try and build a new parallel supply chain that's independent of the Chinese in Zambia.
Yeah, exactly that. So you have that case, and you also have the second recommendation talking about de-risking, which is the key element. And in the US, beyond the de-risking factor, you also have that laws that you have in the Foreign Corruption Act, if I quote it correctly, which is also one of the main elements that's kind of paralyzing a lot of not only US mining, not only US investors, but also Western companies that have their banking account in the US, because you don't want to find yourself caught in the middle of like handing red envelopes or green envelopes, depending on the country, to get access to those minerals. And many companies, they're afraid of those regulations because the countries where you have to do those mining operations, let's face it, being in Latin America, being in Southeast Asia, being in Africa, they're not always the most clean country when it comes to corruption. So you may find yourself in gray area, which if you're in Europe or if in the US, those are not gray, those are black area. But in those countries, they are much more gray than anything else. So having that in mind, you're also afraid that, I don't want to engage in those countries because they're too much risky for me to do right now because of all those regulations. So put aside the insurance part, which is also really important. You also have those kind of regulations that just like paralyze and just block any new company trying to take the risk to go to those countries.
Well, it's interesting that you talk about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. There's been some calls in Washington that the new incoming Republican Congress should consider removing parts of that to allow American companies specifically to compete against the Chinese mining companies in places like Africa. Unlikely that it will pass, but nonetheless, that discussion has been bubbling up.
Yeah, people have been worrying about that a lot.
Yeah, let's turn our attention now to nickel, which is another critical resource used to manufacture EV batteries, and it's used in so many parts of the supply chain. It's also used, it's a part to make steel and lots of different things. It's definitely a critical resource by every definition. But just as copper is heavily concentrated in Latin America, cobalt is predominantly in your country, Giro, the DRC, Indonesia is home to the world's largest nickel reserves. And that puts the Southeast Asian country right in the middle of the crosshairs of this great power competition that we've been talking about for so long on this show. And obviously that's burgeoning now with the return of the Trump administration. So for some perspective on what's going on, I recently spoke with Putra Adhiguna, who is the managing director of the Energy Shift Institute, an independent nonprofit energy finance think tank based in Jakarta. He was absolutely fascinating. I think you're really going to enjoy his conversation. And Giro, I'm looking forward to getting your feedback on the back end of this. Let's take a listen now to my conversation with Putra Adhiguna. Putra Adhiguna, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me, Eric.
Indonesia has a new president, Prabowo Subianto, who's just recently taken power. He said that he's going to continue the policies when it comes to nickel and mining of his predecessor, Joko Widodo. Now, that policy drew lots of money for smelting firms and mining firms, especially from China. It also did a lot to boost exports, but it's also created a massive oversupply of processed nickel that's led to a huge drop in prices. We're looking at something around 45-50% plunge in price over the past year. And then there's also the issue of lots of well-documented cases of labor abuses at the smelting firms and the mines, and then also extensive environmental destruction. When you look back at the Jokowi legacy and now what Prabowo is coming into, how would you describe the state of the nickel industry today in Indonesia?
So I think if we look back, obviously there is the good side of a good intention in this whole nickel downstreaming. That's what we call it, right? When Indonesia basically started to forbid the export of raw nickel and tried to develop its own industry. It originated with the idea that I think the country, like many other countries that are producing natural resource, are frustrated with the fact that they never managed to get any decent part of the processing facilities or manufacturing. But then the Indonesian government took the step of going all the way, as in blocking all the export of the raw nickel ore. And like you said, it managed to cause a rapid expansion of a lot of smelters. Unfortunately, the rapid expansion also didn't carry with it a high standard of development. So to give a bit of a context, Indonesia right now produces about more than half of the global nickel production. So in another way, it has a very big leverage to actually raises the bar in this exploitation process. But in the process, unfortunately, as you mentioned, we're still seeing a lot of challenges on the ground where the country could have done it much better. It seems to be a rushing through the door kind of attitude where the country just basically want to get ahead as soon as possible. But along the way, it kind of forget to set the bar high enough to maintain the standards.
And where does the burden of responsibility, the accountability for this lie? Is it with the foreign mining companies? Is it with the government? Is it maybe with civil society not doing enough to pressure these stakeholders? When you look at these challenges that the Indonesian nickel industry is facing and the society at large is facing when it comes to nickel, where do you think accountability lies?
So firstly, I think it's important to actually divide the mining parts with the basic processing parts, the smelter parts, right? The mining concessions are mostly owned by Indonesian entities, while the smelting part is mostly owned by Chinese entities. Now, to your question, the easy answer is, of course, to say that the smelting facilities is mostly owned by China. But I think the picture is much more complicated than that because ultimately, it is the Indonesian side that opened the door. It is us that gives the permits for the expansion, and it is us who sets the standards of how companies do business in the Indonesian shores, right? So I would say that a big chunk of the challenges actually lies in the domestic politics, as in, Indonesia tried to expand its downstreaming process, and then you have the investors coming in, mostly from China. I think about 85% of the smelting companies are basically Chinese-owned. And unfortunately, those two seems to be matching in intention, right? I mean, both of them just want to do their business quick enough. So I would imagine that the Indonesian government really is the biggest weaknesses in the process. The Chinese obviously has a lot of challenges within their supply chain. So both are combined with the, I would say, the remoteness of the areas that we're talking about, which made the public awareness took some time to kind of keep up with what's actually happening. After a lot of media coverages and talking about the topics about the nickel industry, then the awareness started to slowly grow. So I think it's a little bit of everyone's within the pot.
Now, we focus a lot of attention on the Chinese in part because, as you've said, in the smelting business, they are a dominant player, but they're by no means the only foreign actor in the Indonesian nickel mining supply chain. When you look at the Chinese, how do they compare to other foreign actors or even domestic actors in terms of their ESG and CSR compliance and also their responsiveness to some of the complaints about their business practices?
So if we look back historically, there's a long history of Indonesia's nickel mining and basic processing that comes from companies like Vale, which has been happening for the long decades. There are some small bits and pieces of smaller domestic companies. But I think what really happened is that the rapid expansion was really something that many parties just cannot keep up with in maintaining attention and also keeping the standards high. So to your point about the ESG standards, unfortunately, we've been seeing too many cases of issues, both on the mining side, which is majority Indonesian owned, as well as on the smelting side, which is majority Chinese owned. So on the smelting side, we're seeing compromised standards of workers, safety standards. We're seeing the smelting facility practically blew up every few months or so, causing injuries and even fatalities. On the mining side, we're also seeing, obviously with mining, there's a lot of deforestation that is happening. Many of the miners may not have the best standards, and that really amplifies the situation. So if you're a smelting company, you're basically sourcing your nickel from somewhere, right? And when you don't really set a high standard in how those materials are being sourced, then the problem kind of amplified in the mining side. So I guess, again, within the mining side, there is issues. But on the smelting side, there's also a lot of issues. So both are kind of a match made in heaven, let's put it that way.
Yeah, in the investigation following that explosion that you referenced, I think it was last December, the conclusion was that the government did not do its job in enforcing the laws that are on the books in terms of safety. And so the accountability in this particular case, okay, so the Chinese maybe didn't have the highest standards, but at the end of the day, it's up to the local government to enforce the rules, the regulations, and the laws. What do you think it's going to take in order to improve the governance of the mining industry and the smelting industry in Indonesia by local authorities?
So I think what it's going to take first is the consumers of the nickel product themselves demanding a higher standard. I think that's going to be critical. Whether the demand will be coming from the EV sectors or whether it's going to come from the steel sectors, both will matter in how these practices going to be improved. Because ultimately, the Indonesian government is very sensitive as well to the relevance of the nickel industries moving forward. Now, to your point about the responsibilities of some of these explosions within the smelting side, I think we need to keep in mind that ultimately government and businesses will always have that asymmetry of knowledge, right? I mean, businesses would know best what exactly are they running within their plants. And within the smeltings, we're seeing a combination of some conventionals, technologies, as well as some newer technologies within the smelting side. And I wouldn't think that the government would have a clear idea what they're actually looking at. So in a way, it's really more about responding to the string of cases. Now, that's the problem, right? I mean, if you got 1 or 2 explosions, maybe that's fine. But when it happened every literally 2 to 3 months, then you have a big problem on the enforcement side. The government is doing some things on it. There are some people that, get arrested and the law process is ongoing. But to my first earlier point is that I think moving forward, the government will be more sensitive by more pressures coming from the consuming side of these products, in addition to just basically maintaining a business order as usual.
I guess I'm a little surprised that you have an expectation that the consumer is going to put pressure on. I mean, there was the famous Dua Lipa interview with Tim Cook from Apple, and she confronted Tim Cook and said, "Is there blood cobalt in my iPhone?" And he basically lied to her right up front. He said no.
Right.
And we know that the cobalt supply chain is tainted with artisanal mined cobalt. And the problem is that consumers don't really have a very broad understanding. And if you go to the United States or Europe or any of the markets where they're driving the Teslas with Indonesian nickel in them, a lot of consumers think they're doing something great for the environment. They have no concept that what's powering that Tesla is nickel that comes from some of the places where you said there's a lot of problems. Tesla certainly doesn't want to talk about it. Tim Cook doesn't want to talk about it at Apple. How do you educate consumers when the largest, wealthiest companies in the world don't want to talk about it?
Excellent point. So I think the first answer would be we need to talk about it more, right? So coming back to your first point is that we need to keep in mind in many emerging markets, including Indonesia, the ideal case is that you have a democratic government, the public responds to such an awareness that there is issues, for example, and then the government moves according to the public response within that space. And this comes back to the point about ESG standard enforcement, right? I mean, ESG is basically a voluntary standard, across many, many industries, as you would know. Despite the many critics on ESG, I often like to say that when you can rely less on your government than ESG through multinational value chain, that may be a better bet than relying on the government per se. Now, this is not to say that activist movement, the NGO movement, and law enforcement and public pressure doesn't matter. It does matter. But I think it's really about complementing each other, right? I mean, on the ground, we're seeing more coverage about what's happening within the nickel space, whether it's relating to social effect, environmental effect, and so forth. But relying on those alone from domestic pressure has always been difficult, right? Because obviously the political economy of many countries, including ours in Indonesia, is complicated. You have basically every kind of interest within the nickel and the coal sector intertwined within this development and intertwined within the politics of the country. So that's coming back to the global value chain. It's really about understanding, firstly, the value chain and then raising the pressures on those sides. This is a high call. I fully understand that. It's not something easy. But I do think as well that when we talk about nickel, there's a lot of superficial understanding within the discussions. What I mean by that is that when the whole downstreaming process began, everybody just keep on talking about, this is going to be nickel to EVs and so forth, right? I mean, Energy Shift is actually probably the first that covered in Indonesia that say that, hey, among all these nickel productions, only a minuscule part actually goes to battery factories. The majority actually goes to stainless steel. And this is the kind of things that, again, public awareness only goes so far because many of these things are very, market-related, complex stuff that I think many people need to better understand. So I think it's going to be a combination of both, both from the public side on the domestic front as well as the the global value chain pressures that we need to, constantly hammering on about.
I guess I'm curious because you mentioned that domestically it's more difficult than if there was international pressure. And domestically, it's my understanding that the government is quite sensitive about criticism on this front, particularly from Indonesian civil society. And to the point where NGO workers who are investigating this have had their lives threatened, have been beat up, and have been attacked by both in the media, but also physically attacked in some of the mining sites. And I guess my question is, when independent nonprofit groups like your own and Indonesia's very vibrant NGO sector does try to pressure the government, what is the response when you interface with those stakeholders? How do they respond to the criticisms?
It is unfortunate on what you just mentioned, right? I mean, where activism is basically faced with violence straightforwardly on the ground. But again, if we pull this on a wider economic context, in Indonesia, nickel is only one part of a whole set of challenges. We have a bigger challenges in deforestation for palm oil industries, coal industries, and all kinds of minings and non-mining industries, right? So I think the activism part remains important. But the fair question would be to ask, now that we have all this criticism, has there anything that has changed? And this changing part, I think, is actually a combination from this grassroots activism compiled with the international pressure within the value chain, right? Out of the awareness of all these activism that's happening on the ground. Now, about sensitivities, one thing that we would need to tread carefully when we talk about this whole downstreaming is that how easy the downstreaming or the nickel processing industry can be spin off into the West versus us discussion, right? Because anytime, we literally see a coverage about the nickel industries from any major Western media outlets, for example, right? Criticizing Indonesia's and Chinese investment low standard and so forth. Now, that may be good to push, one Tesla or one Ford or one GM companies to back off from this nickel value chain. But there's two implications that we need to understand. Firstly, if these Western companies back out entirely or partially from the value chain, then more Chinese investment will step in. So that's to benefit of no one, to be honest, to raises the standard. And secondly is that the more coverage of critical views about this whole value chain coming from the West, on the ground, the discussions is unfortunately easily spin off into become, look, the West doesn't want emerging economies like Indonesia to develop its own industries. So there need to be a very fine nuances that people on the ground, including ourselves, need to be able to navigate between China, global value chain, the US, and whatnot, right? I mean, in Indonesia's industrial development. So there's a lot of polarized views, but I think we also need to understand how Indonesians on the ground may see it. So a lot of Indonesians are aware about the low standards on ESG on many of these developments. But I also think that a big chunk of Indonesians are also viewing this from a West versus us discussion. And I think that part need to be, the messaging need to be crafted well enough to navigate those two polarized positions.
Well, there is some context and precedent for what you say about tighter restrictions from, say, the United States opening the way for the Chinese, because, of course, that's exactly what happened in the Congo when they cracked down on what they called blood cobalt. U.S. companies said they couldn't meet the standard, and the Chinese moved in. So there is some context to that, to your point there. But this issue is not just a media narrative issue. It's also a legal issue because the United States has the Inflation Reduction Act. And the Inflation Reduction Act says that there are penalties for companies that buy nickel or any critical resource that touches China or Chinese companies along the value supply chain. That creates real problems for Indonesian nickel because, as you pointed out, so much of the Indonesian nickel that's mined is smelted by Chinese companies. Now, increasingly, we're seeing big investments from the Chinese in battery manufacturing in Indonesia and even auto manufacturing in Indonesia. Great for Indonesia, but again, it makes it more difficult for Indonesian nickel to be compliant with the Inflation Reduction Act. So therefore, now, if Indonesia can't comply with that, U.S. companies may look to the Philippines or other sources of nickel. What role does the IRA now play in the consideration of nickel and Indonesia's role in that supply chain?
It's very important. So I'll cover it in a few points. Point number one is that the majority of Indonesia's EV doesn't use nickel, just like the Chinese style, where they use the iron-based batteries, which are cheaper, which means that even if Indonesia can develop its battery, it's not going to be used domestically or even regionally within Southeast Asia. Now, the consequence of that is that the market share of nickel batteries in the future, while still growing, on an absolute scale, will start to be displaced by the cheaper iron-based batteries. Now, like you said, probably the most promising markets for nickel-based batteries then would likely be the US or the EU. Now, this is where I would say there is no easy answers on this way out. So basically, this is like when you ride the train halfway down the railways, and then the rules start to change, technologies start to change, and policies start to change, right? So IRA matters a lot because the growth part on the nickel battery consumption would likely happen in the US and EU, as I mentioned. Whether the door has been closed, I don't know. The critical minerals agreement has not been easy. I have just spoken with somebody from one of the East Asian countries' representative to try to discuss about this. How do you talk about this, tripartite dynamics on, let's say, a South Korean automakers, an Indonesian nickel, and then a US IRA? And frankly, there is no easy answer to that. Now, what we do hope is that the US doesn't close the door entirely so that the discussion can remain open. And then the Indonesian can actually shows that we can actually improve the value chain rapidly, that is, right? Not just, coasting along. Is it difficult in the US side? I'm sure, because, as we know, there's a lot of domestic pressures happening within the US domestic politics to try to, friendshoring or onshoring the battery supply chains and whatnot. So I don't think it's going to be easy, but, I hope there's still some opportunity down the line, because this also relates to some wider, strategic views between the US, China, and Southeast Asia. I'd like to see it that way, although it's a high call, but I do hope that some of the discussions will be there. Now, another point is that I don't think the Chinese will start building any batteries or EV factories in scale in places like Indonesia, just out of the sheer low level of demand of EVs at the current stage, right? Although that may change in the future. Now, how I'd like to put it is that the Chinese businesses have put their factories, the smelters in Indonesia, to the extent that it benefits them. Tax break, cheap nickel or cheap coal, they'll do it. But that doesn't necessarily mean the rest of the value chain will come. So I think there's a big question mark for Indonesian side on what it's going to do. Unfortunately, I would have to say that I think the bargaining chips for Indonesia is being eroded by the non-nickel battery at this stage. But again, I'm still hopeful that the new administration, which will have a stronger international presence, can kind of work out something between the US, Indonesia, and EU within the process.
So those non-nickel batteries that you're talking about are batteries like lithium phosphate batteries and also sodium ion batteries. Now, LFPs, these are lithium phosphate batteries, for a long time were perceived as not as powerful as NCM batteries, nickel, cobalt, manganese batteries. But now the Chinese have closed that gap, and they've got very powerful lithium phosphate batteries, prompting a lot of people in Indonesia and other places like the Congo, where they produce cobalt, to wonder if they may have missed the moment that the peak of nickel in batteries has passed. And so to your point, that leverage is going away. If that is in fact the case that's happening, what does that bode for the future in terms of improving environmental protection, improving labor conditions, if there's less leverage and the price of nickel remains as low as it is today, giving advantage to Chinese companies who generally operate quite well at the bottom end of the price scale?
So I think Indonesia need to have a clear-eyed views on what actually has happened within the last 5 to 10 years, what has changed right now, and what is the potential outlook moving forward, right? Because so far, Indonesia's downstreaming on nickel is really riding on the wave of we're going to be an EV giant, right? And that statement override everything else. People don't look at the details anymore. They just kind of believe that we will become an EV giant. Although if you look at the numbers, obviously that's not the reality. So I think on the global scale, I would imagine that although LFP will start eroding or continue eroding the nickel batteries on an absolute scale, the global battery market is still growing at double digit, 20% plus, which is still a big room for both the LFP and the nickel batteries to grow with. Even if you get LFP up to 60% of the global market, to grow at that 40% of nickel batteries is still a lot of nickel, right? So that's the first thing to keep in mind. So moving forward, I think Indonesia will also need to look at these more on a full industrialization perspective, not just looking at it as a EVs, batteries. So you need to actually look at what's going to happen with its nickels, whether the stainless steel products can actually be something that Indonesia can be exploring on. Now, I'm fully mindful that stainless steel is not an easy industry, but my point is that the country need to open its eyes, because I think it has been too inward-looking in its self-belief that it will become a giant in the process, while I would say that the ladder towards the EVs and all this expensive value chain seems to be kicked away, midway when Indonesia want to do that. Now, on the mining side, there's a lot of initiatives coming from the government, some businesses that try to raise the standards. Frankly, it will take time. And again, frankly speaking, the standards enforcement is ultimately a matter of law enforcement, right? So it's really about that. It's really about bringing the awareness both on the Indonesian public side. Secondly, raising the urgency, because nickel resource doesn't last a lifetime, right? Some estimates say it's 10 years, some say 15 years. It's no. As you mentioned, we may just have passed the peak. I don't believe we have, by the way, because I think the growth of the nickel battery is still there. But I think it just need a more clear-eyed view of what's going to happen forward.
So we've issued this report, the Nickel Nexus. This is a space that you've done a lot of great work in, trying to educate both international and Indonesian stakeholders. When you think about the nickel industry going forward in the next, say, 12 to 24 months, what do you want people to know about? What do you think is the most important thing that they focus on?
Number one is to understand to what extent and what role can Indonesia actually play within the global nickel value chain in a clearer manner. So not just to give up to this, EV battery narrative, which I think misplaced the attentions on. And secondly, I think what is also important is to look at more on what are the potential motivators and and the pressure points to improve this whole nickel downstreaming process, right? If you're a policymaker based out of Brussels who's trying to make an EU battery passport policy today, the policy to raise the standard is already there. So even if you're a Chinese automakers or battery makers based out of Shenzhen, you would already be sensitive to such pressure by now. So that pressure is starting to land in Indonesia, but I don't think it's strong enough, so to say, right? Again, being mindful that a lot of Indonesians' nickel is actually directed toward the stainless steel industry. So I think right now is really about having an honest discussion, right? What has really happened? This is a time of a new administration. So there's a lot of opportunity to actually evaluate this objectively and moving forward. Now, secondly, this is a hypothesis. I don't think business-oriented downstreaming process will be successful because, as I mentioned, if you're a business, you would only put your factories on the Indonesian shore to the extent that it benefits you, right? If there's not a lot of EV demands in Indonesia and there's all kinds of other battery competitions, outside of Indonesia's, people would think twice or three times before they're actually going to start to build factories in Indonesia. So what I'm meaning by this is that I would imagine that a closer government-to-government cooperation will be needed. This is not just about US or China. This is also about other countries like South Korea. So anybody who's interested in developing a long-term relationships in developing a nickel development in Indonesia. Because I think Indonesia has reached its first leg of nickel downstreaming. But in terms of value addition, that's probably like 10% of the value addition amongst the 100% within the EV value chain, right? And what I'm worried is that if the Chinese are not going to help us going through, not even to the 50%, then we need to find other alternatives. I hope that message is important because, again, the nickel resources doesn't last a lifetime. So the new government better start acting on it.
Yeah, there's a lot of urgency in this. Putra Adhiguna is the managing director of the Energy Shift Institute, an independent nonprofit energy finance think tank in Jakarta, and clearly one of the smartest folks in the business here on nickel and Indonesia. Putra, thank you so much for taking the time to really lay this out so neatly for us so that we all better understand these critical issues. We really appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much, Eric. It's great to be chatting with you.
Giro, it's too bad that you weren't there to join me for the discussion with Putra. He is definitely one of the smartest folks in the space here and really gives a very nuanced understanding. What I like about talking to experts like Putra is the fact of how devoid of any of the extreme politics that we hear so much in the Chinese and in the Western narratives when it comes to these battery metals. These guys are just pure analysts and they just give you the way it is. But there's one point that I want to bring up. And it's a point that I struggle with myself, which is this concept of the foreign entities of concern, FEOC. We often hear a lot of discussion about that. And you have some clarification on that even some points that I may not have gotten 100% right in my discussion with Putra.
So yeah, the foreign entity of concern is one of those concepts that you do find in the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed last year by the Biden administration. So within the IRA, the foreign entity of concerns are where originally all Chinese company which are present in the supply chain of those critical minerals. It was defined in a way that American companies were discouraged to do business with them because if they wanted to take advantage of the IRA's regulation and everything, they had to cut off all those foreign entity of concern. But if I remember correctly, it was at the beginning of this year, the modification came into how they define foreign entity of concern, because before it was only basically all Chinese companies. Now it became all Chinese state-owned companies. The change was made in a way to allow US car makers and EV makers to say, you know what, if you put all Chinese company into the same box, we won't be able to do business. So allow us to at least keep on doing business with Chinese company which are not non-state mining companies, which was made into the definition, allowing certain companies to keep on outsourcing sourcing the nickel from Chinese smelters in Indonesia. And I think Bloomberg reported on that. It was really interesting to see how that definition got changed, because it really came into, not into context, it really came into, it brings reality to the fact that how much China is powerful, how much China is important in that supply chain. And many companies are just grasping it, and which sometimes have the feeling that policymakers are not understanding how much it's just difficult to part away from China. And it's quite almost impossible at this stage of the development of those minerals.
It's difficult to move away from China, but it's also difficult to understand these laws and these U.S. distinctions that they're making in terms of the foreign entities of concern. So for those of you who are new to this topic, the FEOC, that is something very important to follow. And again, it is quite complex. Very quickly, Joel, before we go, because I know you're on your way to the airport today, we talked a lot about the great power competition in critical minerals. This is actually a topic that you're heading up to the Ivory Coast, Abidjan, which is going to be a very long journey for you. Mauritius to South Africa to, traveling in Africa and flying to different African countries is not easy. So you've got a long day of travel ahead for you. But maybe you can just talk about some of the themes you're going to talk about at this ministerial gathering that you're going to be attending in Abidjan, about some of the key themes related to the great power competition for critical resource mining in Africa.
So yes, I'm heading to Abidjan to that exposition that the Côte d'Ivoire government is putting in place. It's a mix of mining and oil industry. They're really trying to have that conversation going on. What Africa can get out of those natural resources? How can you move ahead? And with that, what policy we need to put together? So it's now coming into the context of all this green technology, the change that needs to happen. So me and some other colleagues, we're going to be sitting on a panel with different ministers in Africa talking about the great power competitions, me specifically, because the other topics will be around green minerals, what Africa should do about that. So I'm going to be covering the great power competitions in Africa and how Africa should handle that great power competition, where on one hand you have China, on the other hand you have Western companies, and where's the role in Africa in all of that? How should we approach those great power competition? Should we be confronting or competing? Should we be able to be the referee in that competition where all of them are being interested in what's happening in Africa? Is competition possible or impossible, or cooperation is possible or impossible? So all of that are going to be part of the conversation we're going to have with those ministers, and we're going to try to bring light and nuances in a conversation that sometimes is not so clear for many decision makers and policy makers on the continent, and we're going to try to provide them with the tools of understanding how we should, or as a continent, we should approach those great power competition and how we should take advantage of the opportunities and also put in place mechanism to address the challenges that comes with those rivalry in Africa.
Because that's our editorial line here at CGSP. Just to be very clear, this was what we mentioned in our report, both what you did on cobalt, but also our other reports of what we've done on nickel in Indonesia, that at the end of the day, it does not matter what the Americans think should be done or what the Chinese think should be done. At the end of the day, the resources belong to Africans and Indonesians and Peruvians. What do they want to do with it?
Yeah.
And that's the message we kind of say, because at the end of the day, it's not up for anybody else other than the people whose resources those belong to.
Yeah.
And hopefully those ministers are going to be listening to a very strong message from you that says that they should take the interests of their own people first and foremost before considering those of the Chinese, the Americans, or the Europeans, or the Japanese, Emiratis, or anybody else, for that matter. And so last thoughts for you before you head to the airport on this.
So my last thought was like looking into the interview that you did, the conversation. It was really interesting while I was listening to just find out the similarities that you do find between what's happening in Indonesia and other countries, for example, in the DRC and elsewhere, the political economy of those industries in those countries, how they impact the way regulations are followed or implemented or not. And it's also how it was important to put things into nuance, into perspective. And I really like the way you mentioned the fact that, we have to strike a balance between fighting for ESG and how the message is perceived that they're against Indonesia being able to develop. Because we also have the same trend happening in the DRC. Yes, you put DRC red cobalt because you mentioned that cobalt is not clean. But at the same time, when you put that much pressure, you're just squeezing out any other new competitors that may come and really put new standard on the table. You also just hurting the economy on the ground, because companies moving away from cobalt means that there won't be a lot of money coming into the DRC treasury, and we won't be winning about that. So it was really interesting to see those similarities in both Indonesia and the DRC, and I do believe that there are many countries in the global south will win into having those south-south learning experience, allowing them to know, what, we are facing the same situation, we are facing the same challenges. How should we and how could we approach those situations in a way that we're going to, benefit us countries in the global south? If you put leaders aside, just civil society, scholars, intellectuals to come together and say, you know what, guys, let's work together and let's find ways we can improve our engagement with those big mining companies that's coming either from China, either from the global north as well.
That's right. And there's so much that can be learned from the different experiences of various countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere. And again, another thing that we are trying to do here at CGSP is to foster that South-South engagement. If this is a topic that you're interested in, go to our website. You'll see data visualizations and special reports right there in the navigation. Beginning next year, we're going to be launching a dedicated new site called CGSP Intelligence, which is going to have all of Giro's and Edwin's and our team's analysis on critical resource minerals and all of this mining that we're going to be talking about for EV batteries, for weapons, for technology. All of that is going to be in our new site, CGSP Intelligence. That will be coming next year. In the meantime, you can find the beautiful data set that Giro has done on cobalt. We also have one on nickel, and we've got these great reports. By the way, the cobalt data set that Giro has on the site is updated with 2023 data in it. So that is the most current data on all of the cobalt supply chain in the DRC. So, Giro, thank you very much. On your way to the airport, have a great conference. Tell the ministers, make them a little uncomfortable for us. We want to push them a little bit.
Yes, we're going to try to convey the message that some boldness is required if we want to take advantage of that. Yeah,
it is. So for Giro Nima in Mauritius, for now, on his way to Abidjan, I'm Eric Olander. We'll be back again next week with another edition of the China Global South podcast. Until then, thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Follow the China Global South Project on Twitter @ChinaGS Project and share your thoughts on today's show, or head over to our website at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, where you can subscribe to receive full access to more than 5,000 articles and podcasts. Once again, that's ChinaGlobalSouth.com.